Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar. This is part 4 in the series Mastering Your DER Role, the Return to Duty process. Before we get started, I'd like everyone to know that you are in mute mode. You're going to remain in mute mode for the entire presentation. If you have any questions, we are encouraging them. There is a question panel, so just feel free to type those in and we'll get to those as soon as we can. But for those of you that may not know about Spark TS, let me tell you a little bit about us. We are a third-party administrator for drug and alcohol screening and record keeping. We do drug and alcohol testing and things like MVR checks to help you stay compliant with DOT regulations. We have access to over 4,000 clinics nationwide with online ordering and electronic document management. And finally, our software solution, RailTasker, is designed to help companies manage training and remain compliant with the 243 regulation. We also have a training library with FRA-approved courses and on-the-job training checklists. And in January, as many of you know, we partnered with RailCube and are now able to offer transport planning and management, hours of service, which I know many of you have been asking for, and electronic rule books. We also have asset management to include equipment, service and maintenance management, as well as defect and incident management. Okay, that's enough about our company. Now on to today's speaker, who is Holly Rainwater, who is the Director of Professional Services. And I'm going to turn it over to Holly right now so she can tell us a little bit more about herself.
Thank you. All right, thanks, Diane. I appreciate that. My name's Holly Rainwater, and I have been here at Spark TS for, golly, has it been 3 years? But I've been in the railroad industry, I hate to age myself, over 20 years, maybe more like 25, but here we are. Today, we are going to talk about the return to duty process. Also, before the webinar, I received some questions and answers that we'll get to today as well. As Diane said, please go ahead and send us your questions that you have. I do like to keep these very interactive and make sure that we're discussing what you want to talk about. Just in relevance to today's call, I am a SAP, Certified Employee Assistance Professional, and a DOT Substance Abuse Professional. So in regards to today's topic, I can provide some insight and information in regards to that return to duty process. Well, let's get started. And I'm going to be looking over on my other monitor. So if you notice me looking over, I'll be also checking for some questions as they come in today. All right. So what does a second chance mean? When it comes to drug and alcohol testing and violations, what is that second chance? I want to clarify that second chance is not anything that's under Part 40. It's not under those DOT drug and alcohol testing regulations. And actually, Part 40 is silent. It says nothing about what to do if somebody has a positive test or how they come back to work. It's very silent in that second chance. It's also a common industry practice to do second chances. So maybe I should take a step back and talk about a second chance. Second chance would be if someone had a positive drug, positive alcohol test, maybe they were at work and had a controlled substance. Lots of different things can mean that DOT regulation. But the second chance happens when someone has that violation, they go through the SAP Part 40 return to work process, do all of those requirements, take their DOT return to duty test, and then are released back to work. So some companies let them do it one time, some 0. I've even had companies that do it maybe 2 times. Again, that's all under the company policy, how they come back to work. But again, it's common industry practice. A lot of places will do a second chance. And again, it's how our duties, people come back to work in safety sensitive duties. Now, keep in mind, when it comes to all of this, we've got other regulations that come into play. Some regulations may say, even though you have a violation under Part 40, we are also doing this. For example, on Part 240 and 242 under FRA certification, it means that If you have a positive alcohol test above a 0.04, the regulations actually say you cannot perform DOT, safety sensitive duties, in that role of an engineer conductor for 9 months. So there's other regulations. The SAP may say, hey, you're fine to come back to work. Know your regulations around your safety sensitive employees because there might be other impacts on that role. All right. Is a second chance required? I think I talked just a tiny bit about this. The answer is no. And actually, like I said, also, Part 40 is silent on how we handle this. It's up to the individual company how that's handled. You know, sitting in that role as a DE for many years, I would recommend that no matter how you do this, you're consistent. You're consistent if someone has that violation and you return them. The next day, if someone else has a violation, you can't just say, you could. I wouldn't recommend it that person can just, you can terminate that person. So these are questions you can talk to your attorneys, your employment attorneys, but you want to make sure that you are consistent in your practice. And again, this is for federal regulations. Here's the process. So a DOT violation occurs. Again, this is not company violation, so it's under the DOT agencies. The violation occurs. The employee is then referred to a substance abuse professional. The substance abuse professional and the SAP and the employee have an initial meeting. That in that meeting, the SAP will say, I recommend this for educational treatment. Then the employee participates in that. Once that is completed, there's another meeting, a follow-up meeting between that SAP and the employee for that employee to come back to work. So they just want to make sure, hey, did you do everything? And if all of that comes to fruition and they've done everything they need to do, then the SAP determines if the employee complied. And if they have, they decide, they let the employer know, and the employer decides whether or not they will do a return them safely back to the position. There's that return to duty drug and or alcohol test, and then there's follow-up testing that occurs based on the SAP's recommendation, and that can be anywhere from 1 year to 5 years. We can talk more about those a little bit later in the presentation, but just wanted to talk real high level of what a SAP is, okay? People have to be certified, or there's really nothing in the regulations that say they have to meet certain, do X, Y, and Z, but there is a standard that is out there. SAP is a professional with specific credentials that are noted in Part 40, like a licensed physician, social worker, psychologist. In my situation, I am a SEAP, certified employee assistance professional. And also then you have experience in that area with credits. When we go ahead and do our renewal, there's credits that we have to take as well. The SAPs do the initial evaluation. They do follow-up recommendations for education and treatment. They do aftercare recommendations, and they determine that employee's testing schedule. How this is done is through a combination of clinical expertise and experience and knowledge of the regulation. And in any SAP course that I've been into, it's very important to understand the SAP is not an advocate for you, the employer, or the employee. The SAP's role is to protect the public's interest in public safety. So you're not there to say, hey, employee, I got you. Let's get through this process. And it's not to say, hey, employer, I got you. I'll help whatever you need to do. It's to really look at the overall impact. What will happen when this employee returns back to service? SAP referrals must occur after a DOT violation. Okay, so those again are refusals to take a drug or alcohol test, a verified positive drug test, it's an alcohol result of a 0.04 or greater, or an alcohol violation like perhaps using alcohol 4 hours prior to a safety sensitive shift. A SAP referral occurs whether or not the employee is offered a second chance. Which that means is if you decide, I'm not keeping this employee, they had the violation, one and done, you still, as that employer, are required to give them a SAP referral. So you need to notify them, hey, you're removed from service from DOT safety or safety sensitive work. Here is a list of at least 2 substance abuse professionals that you can reach out to, and here's their contact information. This not only goes for current employees, but it also goes on the same for any pre-employment tests. Applicants that fail a DOT test, you're required to give them those SAP referrals as well. Again, SAP is a DO-specific term. It only is for safety-sensitive employees with DOT violations. I hear often, hey, you know what? I'm going to have this guy go talk to a SAP. They maybe hear that, yeah, Sally, she's having a tough time, and I think she's under having some issues with alcohol, so I'm going to refer her to a SAP. Well, you can't, because a SAP is only there for that DOT violation. You can refer that person to someone who's like a drug and alcohol counselor, or someone that has experience in drug or alcohol testing, but SAP isn't the correct term. And I want to add that because when you have a SAP evaluation, there's a certain list of criteria and that the SAP needs to give back to the employer. If you send somebody in for a DOT SAP evaluation and they really shouldn't have had that, you're going to have a whole list of information that SAP should not have provided you. If a person has a non-DOT test of an alcohol violation of a 0.04, less than a 0.04, there's no SAP referral. Again, that's a company violation. If you had a non-DOT test, there's no SAP referral. If there's any company, like maybe you have a company violation, you can't drink in a hotel room or something like that, that's not a SAP violation. And in those cases, you want to refer them to an EAP or counselor, like I said previously, just to avoid that confusion. Best practices for you as an employer is to check to make sure all SAPs that you're using are qualified before the referral. You don't want to go through this entire process and find out your SAP isn't certified, or they haven't made up their educational requirement. I recommend when you refer someone to a SAP, the next thing you do is say, send me your certifications and your education. They will send that to you. Once you have that, they're certified. Don't make the mistake of them thinking that they're a SAP and they're really not. Also, talk to your SAPs. Do they understand the technical aspects of Part 40 and the return to duty process? Make sure your SAPs know and understand they're the gatekeeper for the return to duty processes. Ask them things like, how many cases have you ever overseen? What do you do when an employee doesn't comply with the case? Another thing I like to recommend is encourage your SAP. I would almost say I would strongly encourage that if you have a drug violation, have your SAP reach out to the MRO and get the lab levels. Find out what really happened. If you have an employee that says, oh, I got too drunk and I snorted a small line of Coke, what does that mean? And if you go in and as a SAP look at those levels, you can determine, was this maybe a one-time thing, or what these levels indicate otherwise, especially with marijuana. They said, oh, I just, something a month ago, and you can go in that their levels are extremely high. That's probably not the case. So get that justification and clarification of that violation from the medical review officer. The employer, you cannot get it, but the SAP can. You're responsible for your service agent's compliance. As that role, as a DER, as a company representative, you're responsible. If you have someone come in and they don't do what they need to do, the agency will take that against you as that employer. Once the referral has occurred and the employee has been evaluated, you cannot change any of that evaluation. Let's say you're not happy with the evaluation, okay? You get that evaluation back and it says, they have 8 hours, they're recommending 8 hours of education. And you're thinking, what's that gonna do? Really, I know they have a huge problem, blah, 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 blah. You can't go back to the SAP and say, I don't like this recommendation, I want you to change it. Or you can't say, I don't like that, I'm gonna go talk to Holly, or I'm gonna go talk to someone else to get their evaluation. You can't. You have to use the evaluation of your SAP. You cannot also impose additional testing requirements, for example, under company authority, on that employee that goes beyond the SAP's follow-up testing plan. We'll take, for example, you are required to do a minimum of 6 drug and or alcohol tests in that first year. Let's say that you said, I want to make sure like the second year they're fine. I'm just going to do non-DOT testing. Or maybe I want to test them once a month. I'm going to do those other tests under non-DOT. You can't. It's only what that SAP has listed in their plan. This again is why it's so important to make those informed decisions when you refer someone to a SAP. Make sure when you refer people to a SAP, they also know the full story. If someone has had a violation, or maybe under company, or maybe they've had a DUI that's been reported to you, anything, provide that information to the SAP so the SAP can make those determinations and have a better educated opportunity. So after that initial recommendation of the education or treatment, the SAP will send an evaluation letter to the employer. They're going to say here, hey, Holly came in and spoke to me today. We're recommending this. So that's the next thing they're going to do. When that SAP goes through the process, things to consider is that not everyone that has a violation has an active substance abuse disorder, right? Not all of them have that. But that's what the SAP evaluation is there for, to determine the type of treatment, duration, monitoring, all of that needs to happen in the return to duty process. In the clinical evaluation, they might talk to family members, or you might try to get some employee history, medical history as well. Maybe if it was a violation for oxycodone, they might want to find out what really happened. How long have you been taking this? They're going to want to get that information. Legal history, talking like DUI, all of those things. Financial status, psychiatric history, substance use history, and what supporting systems that they have. It's not just to get that employee's perspective of what the problem is. They're going to look full circle, holistically, at what's going on. And when you come to say, if you're not happy with this evaluation, and you're like, how did they ever come up with this determination? It's important to understand that as a SAP, they're required to use a clinical assessment tool. The evaluation's not based on gut. It's not based on what that SAP thinks. I think that you really do have a problem, or I don't think you have a problem. There has to be a clinical assessment component to it. There are different tools that SAPs can use. I've listed a few here. They are really helpful in regards to determining whether or not what that holistic view and what their education and treatment should be. We've got the ASI, the audit test, there's DATS, lots of different tests to really focus on that. Other SAPs may say, hey, do this before the evaluation. Maybe we'll do the evaluation and then might sit down and have that evaluation in front of them and talk to the employee. Okay, let's just really talk through this. Find out maybe what really happened. There's different aspects and different tools that SAPs may use to quantify those answers. Levels of education and treatment, they vary, okay? There might be self-help groups. They may say, hey, I want you to go to AA. They may say, hey, I want you to go to this class for education on drug and alcohol use or alcohol use. It could be that they have outpatient therapy. Maybe they're going to a drug and alcohol counselor once a week or 2 times a week. There's other programs, night and evening programs. And then we start looking at intensive outpatient treatment. There you've got a lot more things going on that they're going to be really monitoring that person throughout the day, throughout the week. They're not actually living in a facility, they're actually checking in on a very regular basis. And then if someone is in that situation where they're having some severe issues, for example, alcoholism, if someone's drinking on a regular basis and they just stop drinking, there's a possibility that person is going to go through a phase where they need to actually detox. And that detox shouldn't occur at home. There are examples where someone's detoxing at home and they could pass away. It's best if there's going through that phase to get them to a center, take them to the hospital so they can detox with people watching over them. There's also sober living, and then there's that inpatient treatment. Usually that might go 21 to 28 days. There's halfway houses, but usually after an inpatient stay, there's that intensive outpatient treatment that occurs afterwards to help get them ready to get back into what society really is. Here's what it's like to go back home when, maybe your wife has a drink or two. Here's how not to do that. There's a lot of things that can happen. Those can happen by their own, or again, indifferent. You can mix and match those type of things. You really want to make sure that those clinical concerns are addressed with substance abuse disorder, and you want to make sure in that evaluation and when you talk to that employee, they understand if they have another issue that happens again, what consequences are. The DER, they really need to review, or excuse me, the SAP is reviewing documents. So when that clinical assessment is complete, that SAP is going in and reviewing all those education documents. As a DER, you can't see any of those, but you will be able to see those as a SAP. You'll see when they participated, any notes you have, things such as like when Johnny came to the rehab facility, he tested positive for methamphetamines. Those type of things are going to come up. Maybe if they have continual periodic drug screens, the SAP is going to have that information where the DER would not get that information. Once they're happy with and feel that they can determine that person is ready or not ready to come back to work, information is sent to the DER. Okay, and that information includes the follow-up testing, again, a minimum of 6 in the first 12-month period, but also understand your applicable DOT agency violations. I'll pick on FRA. FRA conductors and engineers are required, if they have a DOT violation, to have 6 drug and alcohol tests in that first year. That's a minimum. A lot of times, if you send someone to a SAP that doesn't know that, you may get something back that says, hey, Engineer Jones had a DOT violation and they just need to have a drug test. That's a situation where you can go back to the SAP and say, hey, I need you to update this. I need you to go in and say, no, they need a drug and alcohol test, not just one. The SAP can extend that for 5 years. The SAP determines the number of tests. They determine if it's drug, alcohol, or both. But as the employer, you determine the dates. If the SAP comes back and says, I want you to test them the day after Thanksgiving, on New Year's Day, and on Independence Day, okay, you need to go back to your SAP and say, no, you give me the periods. What are those periods that I can test in? It might be do 3 tests in the first 2 months. It might be then for the next 8, I want you to do 15. As a DER, you go ahead and schedule them as you need. If the SAP provides aftercare recommendations, maybe the SAP says you need to go and ensure that you go to AA twice a week, or I need you to go to I want you to go talk to your psychologist once a month. Those aftercare recommendations aren't necessarily monitored by the SAP. As an employer, you're going to want to come up with practices to monitor those aftercare requirements. And when that SAP determines when that employee is ready to come back to service, that employee can't come back to service until that SAP letter says they've complied with the evaluation, okay, and their recommendations. The SAP's not going to tell you, you must take this person back, they're going to say they've completed and they've complied with the SAPs recommendations. Then that employee must undergo return to duty testing and have a negative result. Ultimately, it's the employer's decision after that if they can return back to a safety sensitive position. Now, there are caveats in here. So, again, this is just dealing and handling of DOT. Let's say someone does have a DOT violation and they're out of service. Technically, if you put them as a clerk, maybe a non-DOT position, that's not a safety sensitive role, so they could do that. But as an employer, you want to take a look at the full scope and what's the risk? What's that going to do if you do that? The SAP letters, they're going to make sure the initial evaluation and the follow-up evaluation are there. Part 4311 has all the information that's required in that SAP letter. But I want to make sure that the reports don't have typos. If I had $1 for every time I got a SAP evaluation with the wrong DOT agency, we could probably all go out for a nice meal. You want to make sure it's not confusing in that letter. You want to make sure it's very clear, and you can send those letters back to the SAP to have them correct those. And again, follow-up plans must be at least 6 tests over the first year. They can't exceed 60 months. It has to be cleared. And if it's in more than one place, if they say, here's what's going to happen, it really needs to be consistent. I think, what we could do now, I don't know if anybody's got any questions. We're going through a lot of information. And of course, if you know me, I've done a lot of talking. Do we have any questions right now in regards to anything that we may have covered so far, or any comments? Okay. We'll keep going a little bit here. Is that you're going to want to make sure the SAPs plan is being followed. So when you bring that employee back to work, you need to monitor that testing. If you're telling a manager you need to do a follow-up test on an employee this month and you don't follow back up and it's 2 months later, you may be behind schedule. So make sure you're following the follow-up plan. You also want to make sure testing is unpredictable, okay? Don't test that person every Monday morning at 8 o'clock, or don't test that person at the end of their shift every time, or the first of the month every time, or even one test a month every time. It has to be unpredictable. And your auditors are going to look at that. They're going to look at when you're testing and how often you're testing. I hate to say this, but one of the things that I used to do is, in order to be unpredictable, is I would actually have an employee tested maybe on a Monday and then have them tested on Tuesday again. It was amazing at the number of violations that I found, because the employee thought, I'm scot-free, I'm good, I can handle this, they're not going to catch me. They could actually go in and see that now I have a violation. And it's definitely something that I would encourage that you look at. Leave of absences. So it is possible that during a follow-up program, someone could have a leave of absence. Okay. At this point, if someone has a leave of absence, their plan isn't over. Their plan doesn't stop. It's actually paused. Okay. The timing, this will affect the timing of the follow-up program. So really, if you've got here, it says John is prescribed 1 follow-up test per month for 24 months, and they have 24 tests over 2 years, you're going to want to make sure that if that plan stops, when they come back, it picks up exactly where it left off. Now, I wouldn't be a fan of doing 1 follow-up test every 24 months, because guess what? John's going to figure it out. Okay. That's where you maybe want to get with your SAP and say, can we, 1 test a month is silly. Maybe we do, can you consider maybe breaking it up over a quarter? After 6 months and 6 successful tests, the John Doe goes on a leave of absence. Technically, they've met the requirement, but still you want to keep that case open for another 3 months when testing is paused, and maybe it will go on. On the non-DOT side, there's a difference. State law and maybe your DOT agency rules may have different requirements. Many state laws only allow testing for company violations up to 2 years. You also want to make sure you understand those ramifications. Regardless, when you have these leaves or pauses, you're going to want to document the reason. So you can note John Doe went on a leave of absence on January 1st for a medical reason and returned on June 10th. So make sure you're tracking those things. Record keeping, Part 40 says you need to keep those records for 5 years, and that's even records of positive tests of a 0.02 or greater, records of verified positive drug tests, refusal documentation, SAP reports, and all follow-up tests and schedules for follow-up tests. You want to make sure you're keeping those follow-up test records for 5 years. So if that, you could have that file around for 10 years. You're going to want to make sure that you are following the record keeping requirements. Your DOT agency may have additional requirements that they require. So make sure that you understand that as well. Questions?
Could you speak more about the steps to take after a donor has failed to provide a specimen within the 3-hour time frame?
Sure. Now we're talking about the return to the shy bladder process, right? This can be a tricky one because this could mean a DOT violation or not. In regards to the shy bladder, and again, this is me talking, but in the shy bladder process, you really want to take care from the start of the test, okay? I just want to clarify this first. You want to make sure that donor crossed the threshold to the bathroom to start your 3-hour clock, okay? You want to make sure that when the collector says, I need you to go in and provide a sample, if the donor goes, I don't have to go, and then the collector says, oh, I'll just sit here then for 3 hours, the window doesn't start then. The window starts the minute they cross the threshold. Make sure you know that. You're also going to want to make sure that you're tracking the amount of water they drink, and you're going to want to track every time they make an attempt. I hate to say this, but like sometimes collectors will bring them in and it pretty much dribbles all of it out, okay? It doesn't happen a lot, but it could. But you're going to want to make sure you're watching all of this. One practice that I did in my role was I would have the collector reach out to me 2 hours in the test. I could make sure that we were doing everything correctly. I might even talk to the employee to make sure everything was okay, if they had any questions. Sometimes it just helped calm the employee. We want also make sure they understand the ramifications. It was even things as, okay, I know this might be hard, but drink a little bit more water. And I don't want you to go in. I want you to fill that bladder up. So you might have to wait a little longer than 5 minutes to go into the restroom. Handle all of that with, I'll say, grace and tact. Going into that 3-hour time frame and after it can go smoothly. I have found is if you're a DER and you're handling that as that process is going on, you might not have to deal with if someone doesn't provide a sample. But if someone doesn't provide that sample and that 3 hours has gone by, you don't have a sample, you don't have anything to send in to the lab, but you have a chain of custody. Make sure everything that we talked through, the attempts, the amount of water drank, is all sent to the medical review officer, because at the end of the day, the medical review officer is going to review all that information and make the final determination whether or not that person has a legitimate shy bladder, that medical condition that would ensure that they couldn't provide a sample. And the same actually goes with a shy lung. But of course, you're not going to wait 3 hours for someone to provide a sample. You're going to give them a sufficient number of attempts to ensure that they're not trying to evade the test. Many of the EBTs now have a manual mode. So if you're in that whole process, the collector can hit manual and it gets a sample. So it needs very little air to get a sufficient test. So again, the medical review officer will get that information And then you would need to send that employee into a medical physician to get an evaluation. At this point, I would be talking to your medical review officer. Hey, medical review officer, I had someone who had a shy bladder. What do you recommend? What doctor should I go to? Have you worked with anybody in the past? Have that communication with them, because what you don't want is you don't want them to go to their family doctor, because who is going to represent that employee? That medical doctor is going to say, oh yeah, you don't have this. You don't have a shy bladder. Or you do. Yeah, you do. You want to have a clear picture of what's really going on. Sending to someone who specializes in those areas is definitely a great recommendation that your MRO might recommend, because those notes from that visit will go to your medical review officer. And when your employee is having that exam, that medical professional should be going back and saying, okay, I need to talk to your doctor. I need to obtain your doctor's notes to determine if you really do have a legitimate shy bladder. So those are definitely things you want to do. Again, I always told donors, I don't want to say this, but I really want you to provide a sample for me. I really want that, because I don't want to go through this refusal process, and you don't want to go through this process. What do we need to do to get that process? Long story. I hope that helps the person that asked that question.
We have one other question, Holly. The onboarding process with pre-check of documentation in onboarding planning phase. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure the extent of this question. So if the person who asked this question maybe wants to put a little more backstory into the chat. But as I look at this question, perhaps it is on the hiring process. When you are bringing in an employee in a DOT regulated position, you want to make sure that they are going through all the steps of that required specific DOT agency. Many are alike, some are different. FMCSA, you need to take your FMCSA drug test. You then need to fill out the information regarding the FMCSA clearinghouse. They have to register. They have to then have the DER or the applicable person run a query on that person, and then it's a full, and then you need to have those results come back, and then any applicable information afterwards, like for the driver qualification file, training, and those type of things. Additionally, with the FMCSA specifically, or any regulation outside of FMCSA, if you know that somebody worked in a DOT regulated position outside of FMCSA, you have to go back to the paper form for a background check on the 40.25. So the 40.25 again is where you go back 2 years to verify if a person worked for a DOT agency, and if they did that person have a positive pre-employment drug or alcohol test, and if they had a positive violation, they would need to note that, and then that information goes to the previous employer for them to qualify. Because just as we were paused in the medical, if someone goes on their follow-up exam, if someone goes and quits a position and they're in the middle of a follow-up program, that follow-up program picks up and follows the employee to their next job. So it's like a pause, but as that employer, you're required to get that. But other things I would encourage when you're onboarding, look at your DOT agency and what will they look at. DOT agencies want to know, how are you educating your people? So you're going to want to have that information. How you document how you do that. We a lot of times will use our learning management system that says, hey, here's the education requirements. They go in and take those courses, take those exams, and they're not difficult exams. It might just be, hey, do you understand that XYZ? It could be that simple. And then keeping that certification that says, yeah, I did go through that exam, or I did go through that course. Just tracking and monitoring all of those in that process. Hopefully that helped answer that. I do want to thank all of you for attending today. My contact information is listed here. Otherwise, we've got our support team number on here and our support email. Feel free to contact that team, and they will definitely get you in the right direction in regards to any RailCube, any Spark TS and RailTasker and TPA service needs that you may have. Also, check out our website, sparkts.net. If you go on the website, you can see past webinars that we've done. Additionally, we've got lots of resources and blogs out there. Really, we want to help you do your job better and help you do your job compliant. All right, with no more questions, we'll close up today, and thank you for attending and have a great day.